Hey, Randy Joe here, and welcome to 2025. That means another year is over. 2024 has officially come to an end, and with that, of course, we have to check out the top 10 best records, in my opinion, of 2024. These are the best of the best that I listened to, but keep in mind, 2024 was a fairly light year for me, for new releases at least, since with the channel doing a monthly genre series that I did where I covered a different genre every month, I only was able to tackle only a good 30 or so brand new records of 2024, whereas the rest, I kept it quite classic. That being said, of those 30 or so records that I listened to, here are my top 10 of the year. Also, before we get started, I just wanted to say, if you are interested in checking out my reaction to these albums, the link will be in the descriptions for the albums I talk about on this video. Now, of course, I did not react to all of the albums here, but the ones that I did react to, I will put a link down below if you want to check out those. Coming in at 10th place, we've got Where's My Utopia by Yard Act. Now, Yard Act is a post-punk, dance-punk band that only has about 2 LPs so far. Where's My Utopia is their sophomore album, and in my opinion, the greater album of the two. I really enjoy the songwriting on this one. I think the songwriting is the key component to take away here, as well as the overall very dance and kind of disco fusion that comes with this LP. Specifically, the 2 tracks We Make Hits as well as Dream Job really highlighting the very dance and disco appeal of the LP, while songs like Down by the Stream, Fizzy Fish, and in my opinion, the peak of the album, Blackpool Illuminations, really showcase the incredible songwriting that's on display here. Because as you go from track to track on this record, there are some very loose sort of songwriting tidbits that are all very carefully put together and kind of culminate in Blackpool Illuminations, which is an entire track about the vocalist telling you a story of his childhood and trying to achieve and find utopia in life. And there's a certain type of beauty to this track, especially as it all culminates in the end with him realizing that utopia, the dream job that he wanted, all of this kind of idealistic vision is kind of unrealistic and unachievable, but in the end, the utopia is the family and the life that he was able to kind of create and maintain through the years. Quite a beautiful record. I really like the songwriting. I think it's a very punchy record, and I think it's also quite underrated, considering you don't see it talked about too much on music forums. But in 9th place is not an underrated album, at least not by most people's standards, I would say. That, of course, being Billie Eilish's Hit Me Hard and Soft. On her 3rd LP, she gets a lot more kind of melancholic, a lot more withdrawn, even more than ever, I would say, and feels far even moodier, especially on tracks like Chihiro or, of course, Wildflower, where I feel like the atmosphere and the overall arrangements are super lush, super beautiful, and overall quite hypnotic. This is one of her more quiet records, and definitely I feel like of the 3 albums of hers that she has released so far, her most subtle, but in my opinion, it is perhaps her most strongest work yet, with some incredible songwriting and some very interesting directions that she decides to take on some of these tracks. For example, on the track L'amour de ma vie, you have Billie kind of leaning into a hyper-pop finish as it kind of explodes and transitions about halfway through. And honestly, it is very interesting to hear Billie Eilish take on such a distinct, unique, and again, very influential sound that is just becoming quite popular in today's musical climate. But moving on from there, in our 8th place, we've got Jpig Mafia's I Lay Down My Life For You. Now, even though this is not my favorite Jpig Mafia album, and it's not the one I would go back to the most, that of course would be All My Heroes Are Cornballs, an incredible record, I Lay Down My Life For You is a very interesting direction for Jpig Mafia to go into, because it is him diving fully in to the punk, rock, rap aesthetic that he has teased for so very long. This thing is very aggressive, very punky, very political, as one would come to expect from Jpig Mafia, but even the sound of this record is very claustrophobic and includes some very powerful yelps, grunts, and shouts that are, again, very much a fusion of punk and rock and rap. It also contains some of his most interesting tracks to date, such as Ex-Military, which is most notable for containing the same sample that Wu-Tang Clan used on the track Tears. And we also have some really great collaborations on here, such as Vince Staples appearing on here, as well as Denzel Curry with Jpig Ultra, kind of teasing a long-awaited project from the two of them that people have been yearning for many years. I feel like on top of that, this is perhaps Jpig Mafia's least bloated record to date. This thing is pretty much, classic after classic on here, with very few tracks feeling like they are a little bit of filler or a little bit of extra, could have been left on a deluxe. Instead, this thing is quite tight and does not overstay its welcome. For our 7th place, we have none other than perhaps one of the biggest stars of the year, a star who has been around for well over a decade at this point, that of course being Kendrick Lamar with GNX. Hot off the heels from his Drake beef, Kendrick Lamar pulls through with perhaps his most banger-filled album to date. Most people would point towards Damn as being his banger LP meant to make hits, but GNX, to me, is far more powerful and has a lot more bite than that of Damn. It is a record that feels far more hungry, and you get a Kendrick Lamar that feels like he is far more ruthless, direct, and quite punchy in his delivery. On top of that, the production here matches that energy by feeling like it is just drilling into your brain with some incredibly LA influenced beats that really showcase the culture and Kendrick Lamar's upbringing and the influences that he wears on his sleeve, such as, of course, Tupac, who you can really hear on the track
Reincarnated,
but also brings in influences of DMX in his delivery. SZA on this LP also adds a lot to its sound with her very beautiful R&B focus on the tracks Gloria and Luther, and overall this album is Kendrick Lamar really thinking about his influence, his power on the industry, and really who he is at this point in his career in a very fiery, punchy, and hungry sort of way. And it is by far, I would say, Kendrick Lamar's most instantly engaging LPs without having a overarching concept. But you know what is not hungry, you know what does not have a lot of bite, is going to be my album in the 6th place, that being King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard's Flight B741. This thing is the opposite of a GNX. This is an album all about spreading positivity and love through the music of blues. King Gizzard has been known to jump from genre to genre. They are certainly no stranger to experimentation in their sound. And Flight B741 is them continuing to evolve, and this time really jumping fully into the blues sound that they kind of played with on Fishing for Fishies. This sort of backcountry blues sound feels like it is reminiscent of a Creedence Clearwater Revival in a sense, by having a very Bayou Boy finish to it, and they divulge onto themes of love, positivity, and overall good vibes, as the boys here really do feel like the most unified they've ever been on a record, especially since all 6 of them share vocal duties throughout this LP, kind of trading off the mic to one another, really giving a unified and community focus to the LP. It is clearly their most fun record so far, which is saying a lot considering they are 26 albums deep into their discography, but honestly I can't imagine listening to this record and not feeling the overall joy and good vibes that are coming off from the boys throughout this blues beautiful piece of work. And on top of that, it closes out with Daily Blues, one of their most enveloping tracks to date that really takes the idea of love, community, and good vibes and pushes it fully to the point of not only loving your comrades and your fellow friends, but grabbing your haters and looking them in the eye and proclaiming that you love them just as much. But coming in our 5th spot is going to be none other than Jordy Greep with the new sound. Now, one of the saddest things to come out of this year, especially for hardcore music nerds, was seeing the end of Black Midi as they go on their what seems to be a permanent hiatus, where the 3 band members have officially dissolved. But shortly after, Jordy Greep came through just a couple weeks later with the first single from here, Holy Holy, and announced this record, the new sound, much to fans' satisfaction. When this thing came out just a couple months after the end of Black Midi, it solidified Jordy Greep as one of the most interesting and unique artists working today. as he not only continued the prog rock sounds that came from Black Midi, but he also brought on heavy influences of Brazilian music, and with that made what seems to be an entire concept record about the desperation of man pleading for their sexual and romantic urges. This thing is like a corrupt album full of sad love songs. None of them are quite, what you'd expect from a traditional love track, and really take on very unique and twisted turns, as most of the characters on this album, if not a singular character, are quite sad, depressed, and desperate. And not only does this record contain some of the best concepts and songwriting of Jordy Greeps to date, really showing a lot of the Greepisms that he interpolates a lot into his lyricism, but it all culminates in the 12-minute epic The Magician, which is, in my opinion, a clear top 3 track that Greep has ever been a part of. Because as this thing develops and unfolds, you get him really pouring his heart out to this person who has seemed to completely corrupted his mind to the point where he has fallen apart and he is just the husk of a man. And as the record closes out in a spectacular fashion, it gets more noisy and more claustrophobic than perhaps any Black Midi track in their entire run. And then finally, as this album comes to a close, it ends it with a Frank Sinatra cover, continuing to show Jordy Greeps' appreciation and love for the classic vocal jazz era of the 50s and 60s. Now, although I do prefer Hellfire from Black Midi, their final LP, I do think that the new sound really does show Jordy Greeps' influences far more than anything he's done before, while still being quite inventive and forward-thinking in its sound. But coming in at the 4th spot, we've got MGMT with Loss of Life. This psychedelic pop LP is really just a beautiful odyssey into introspection, into self-discovery, into really, learning to love and care for your own life and appreciate what you have when you have it. There is a plethora of really well-written and moody tracks throughout this record that really kind of showcase MGMT's unique sense of production and atmosphere that feels kind of influenced from that of the 70s and 80s Brian Eno era, as well as taking on a retro finish in a similar fashion of Total Eclipse of the Heart from the 80s on the track Dancing in Babylon. And even though this is not MGMT's most instantly catchy LPs, this is definitely not one made for the masses. It is certainly one that focuses on subtlety, on songwriting, and really careful arrangements that, to me, really show their creative genius more than anything they've done so far. It is certainly up there as one of their best, as the different sounds and sonic landscapes that this thing kind of captures are really quite diverse, while still feeling very unified. As we get to the final track here, for example, on the title track, Loss of Life, it has this explosive kind of EDM finish to it, very danceable as it explodes and embraces the fragility of life. While tracks such as Nothing Changes really kind of embrace a much slower, jazzier finish, and again also has just as much explosion in its sound as it reaches its final 2 minutes. Again, kind of tackling the idea of life, the repetition of it, and the Sisyphus-like mythos that kind of comes with day-to-day life. There is really a lot going on in this record that I feel like really flew under the radar for many people, but still, it is easily one of their best records and definitely one of the most underrated records, if not the most underrated record that I listened to this year. It's one that I always come back to, and I'm always more and more impressed on the very subtle moments and kind of little effects that they choose to use and interpolate that really add so much flavor. And as somebody who really enjoys introspective songwriting, this record is one of the best to do it this year. But continuing on that theme of introspection, the album in the number 3 spot is going to be none other than perhaps the biggest album of the year, that being Charli XCX's album, Brat. Now, even though this is not her most experimental record to date, and a lot of people love to point that out when they point out the fact that this is not their favorite Charli XCX record, this is perhaps her most introspective and I would say interesting LPs so far. It's a great melding of the experimental kind of hyperpop flavor that she's toyed around with and kind of fully dived into at this point in her career in the past with records like Charlie and How I'm Feeling Now, but also blending in a much more approachable, accessible, and sort of dance focus that is certainly more for the mainstream. And in my opinion, the best records typically do blend the experimental with the accessible to the point where it is a great melding and kind of 50-50 of the two. And Brat certainly does that. It sticks to landing by being just as engaging and as mainstream as possible, while still having so much in the hyperpop realm that is still very much outside the norm for most audiences. And layering in these very catchy and beautiful sort of dance bangers is Charli XCX's songwriting that is on full display here, perhaps more than ever, as she not only talks on themes of party culture that are so prevalent throughout her discography, but she also brings in themes of wanting to be a mother, of feeling like she is not on the same level as her contemporaries, feeling quite inadequate in who she is as a human being, or having some sense of imposter syndrome. There's also a really sad and beautiful, touching tribute to the unfortunate late artist Sophie, who passed just a few years ago, in the track So I, where she really pours her heart out here and kind of wishes she paid more attention to Sophie, gave her more recognition during her lifetime, and really just appreciated her more rather than kind of shoved and pushed her to the side. That kind of showcases, again, Charli XCX in a much more vulnerable state, perhaps more vulnerable than we've ever heard her before. And on top of that, ending the record with 365, kind of looping things back to the opening track, reusing a lot of those elements, it makes for a really great, unique, whole, and concise LP overall. And honestly, with Brat being the biggest album for Charli XCX and one of the biggest, most culturally defining albums of the year, it is certainly worthy of a place in, I think, most people's top 5. In my number 2 spot is going to be a record that flew under the radar for most individuals. In fact, I feel like you would not have checked out this record or even heard of it unless you are a fan of the experimental rock band Geese. Because the record in my number 2 spot is going to be the lead vocalist from Geese, and that being Cameron Winter with his LP, Heavy Metal. Now, funny enough, despite the fact that this album is called Heavy Metal, it's the polar opposite of the genre that it's named after. Instead, is a very soft singer-songwriter type LP that is very reminiscent of a Leonard Cohen or a Scott Walker, and also bringing on the influences and sounds of a Black Country New Road. It really feels like if you took the 3 of those artists and melded them together to make an album that is a nice blend of religion, introspection, and really your own insecurities in this world. Because Cameron Winter here is not only his most depressed he's ever sound, but it is definitely his most potent and best songwriting to date. Because, for example, on the track $0, Cameron Winter confesses a love for another to the point where he is claiming that he feels like a $0 bill in this person's hand, or a $1 bill even, really showing that he feels like maybe he is one of perhaps low worth, and ending the track with a proclamation of his love for God, perhaps seeing this person as this godlike figure, given their sense of beauty. And overall, there's just a multitude of really great, beautiful, kind of love-focused tracks, such as Nausicaa, another slowly developing beautiful track, as he ends the track shouting out the love for this woman, yelling Nausicaa on repeat, and kind of using a harsh vocal distortion on it. Or Love Takes Miles, which is probably the most accessible song on here, and still feels very kind of indie, very cute, something that you might see in like a Wes Anderson film. Overall, this thing is quite subtle. It's quite beautiful. I really wish more people listened to it. But hopefully as time goes on, people will come around and find it, discover it, and appreciate it for the genius that it is. This is, in my opinion, perhaps one of the best musicians working today. I think Cameron Winter is going to be seen as a very important cultural figure in the indie scene, hopefully within the next 10 years. Because he really does feel like he is filling in the shoes of an Isaac Wood from Black Country New Road, and kind of continuing on the legacy of some great singer-songwriters from the 70s. But in my number 1 spot, my favorite record of the year, the album that I come back to the most, the album that I feel like we really should, be shouting from the rooftops here, and I have been, that's going to be Magdalena Bay's album, Imaginal Disc. I listened to this thing for the first time on my channel at the beginning of December, so I caught this thing quite late. However, since hearing it for the first time, I have listened to it well over, a dozen times since. It is an absolute beautiful masterpiece from start to finish that is entirely focused on incredible, unique, powerful production that is only further elevated by the really touching, sweet lyricism of the album. There are singular lines on this thing that when I hear them each time, I can't help but tear up and swell with sadness, or at the very least, a melancholic happiness. For example, the very sweet love track Angel on a Satellite feels like it is a strong proclamation of love for another, but could just as easily be seen as a love for oneself and a growing passion and confidence in oneself. The 3-track run from Vampire in the Corner to Watching TV to Tunnel Vision is honestly one of the best 3-track runs of the year, if not the singular best, as they flow all from one to the next and kind of conclude in the very powerful and enveloping synthy overblown effect of Tunnel Vision, sliding right into Love Is Everywhere, which is really just a highlight on the album for the great bass playing throughout this thing. Super funky, super retro, just like the rest of this thing, while still feeling very futuristic, out of this world, and very heavenly. The concept of this album, although loose, is one of identity, one of love, one of growing confidence, and you can't help but feel as this thing goes on a sense of introspection in your own self, and you can't help but feel like perhaps you become a stronger and better person for it. And similar to the way Charlie XCX did on Brat, kind of reinterpreting themes and ideas all in the final track and kind of looping things all around, the final track on here kind of takes a lot of the same lyrics from earlier on this LP and kind of reuses them, recontextualizes them, brings it all around in a singular loop, and it makes this thing feel incredibly concise, incredibly cohesive, and overall just a beautiful finale to the record, like a very strong victory lap after the incredibly touching Angel on a Satellite. And that's not even really getting in to the disco sounds and the dance elements of this record being so poppy and so fun and energetic and just invigorating for the listener. Death and Romance, for example, is hands down, if not the singular best dance song I heard this year. It is super catchy. It is full of really tight grooves. And I can't imagine anybody listening to this thing and not feeling the need to move their entire body. Really, when it comes down to it, I do think Imaginal Disc is going to go down as one of the best albums, not of just 2024, but of the 2020s, because this thing is incredibly impactful, very tight, and honestly just has a very strong sense of identity that it never wavers. And in this decade where it feels like so many artists are trying to kind of recapture nostalgia and the classic era of the 70s and 80s, Imaginal Disc feels like it takes that and pushes it into the next decade because they are so far ahead of the curve while at the same time still appreciating and loving the contemporaries of the past. And so for that, I do think that this is easily the best album of the year. I can't think of any record that really just sticks the landing from front to back as much as this one. So Magdalena Bay's Imaginal Disc is my album of the year, hands down. But that does it for my top 10 of 2024. I really appreciate you watching if you made it this far. I really appreciate you watching throughout 2024 and following along on this channel. And I hope 2025 will have albums that are just as impressive as the 10 albums that we covered throughout this video. As always, my name is Randy Joe. I appreciate you watching, and I'm signing off.